to Cuba. And usually what we got in response was more of a strategic plan for the future rather than expressing, especially people associated with government or state-owned businesses, didn't want to identify a specific company. But the vice president of Habanos, the cigar company, said, well, here's our strategic plan for that 60% of the market that we have 0% share of. And in fact, our strategic plan has an operational component. We've already stockpiled 300 million cigars that are designed, that are intended for that market. The guy who's the business manager for the sugarcane industry described the business strategy for the future and how and why they wanted foreign investment, and that the plan showed how it would be used to develop irrigation, develop remechanization of the equipment being used for production and processing of sugar. And as one of these guys mentioned, the same thing when we talked to the tourism expert, was here's our strategic plan for the future. So the response was more agriculture, tourism, biotech are strategic industries for our country. At least medium term, rum and tobacco are strategic. And interestingly, those weren't framed as egg businesses. They were framed as consumer retail businesses, even though they come from egg products. So, you know, those major industries, they seem to have these strategic plans in place, and that tended to be the response we got with a very, to me, Susan, tell me if you felt the same way. My impression was they're assuming a very high probability of normalization over a 5 to 10 year period in the very near future. You don't stockpile 300 million cigars with no market for them unless you really think that market's going to open to you. Oh, I know. No, so you can now bring $100 worth of cigars or rum back to the U.S. That's not going to fuel the rum or tobacco industries in Cuba. It might drive more tourism to Cuba, but, and you know, interestingly, even the tourism guy talked about their plans. You know, I mean, and this is the space where this facility can go, and this space where this facility can go. Also talked about not wanting to make the same mistake Cuba has made 3 times in the past of relying on A, a single industry, sugar, B, a single foreign partner. And they all express concern about, we don't want to be a Cuban-American country. We want to be a global country.
I'm just going to ask you a follow-up on that a little bit more. So let's say there is normalization of economic exchange between the U.S. and Cuba. They may have a strategic plan, at least on some level. Are they really set up to regulate in a way that's helpful for their organization if there is suddenly just this flood of U.S. dollars in investment, that we won't just have a new set of winners?
Yeah.
Right? And it'll shift, but...
That's my biggest concern, is that that's all we'll end up with. We'll just end up with that the income disparity will just be, you know, multiple factors of what it is now, that you'll have a small set of big winners. My biggest fear of that is that many of the big winners will take the money out of Cuba, and it won't be used, and that was a lot of what, yeah. But I do think, and I think Erin mentioned that, you know, because of, I've spent a lot of time in Vietnam, for example, and studying what's happened in Vietnam as it opened up. Now, it made the choice to open up, right? And the U.S. followed in allowing that sort of behavior. But I think the thing that's really different is that when Western companies went into Vietnam, when Western companies went into China, when they're going into Cambodia, they're going into Myanmar, for the most part, the initial move was unskilled labor at lowest cost available for products that were not being sold in that country. The product was being taken out of the country. The value, most value is generated after the thing is put together, right? And that the profits were being taken out of the country. In Cuba, there's a chance that they might utilize that talent that is there. Yeah, so we have to do business training, but that happens. But there's a chance that these firms will be localized. They'll use local employees. There's a chance that if they're joint ventures, at least a significant amount of the profits will stay in the country and contribute to the broader development of the economic and social fabric of the country. And there's an equal chance probably that they're going to be big winners in small numbers and a bunch of people who end up worse off than they are now. And I'm hoping that we find a better balance than that somewhere along the way.
What about the infrastructure of the country as a role that foreigners could play in helping to improve public investment?
Well, there's clearly need for improved infrastructure. I mean, the power grid is better than it was 10 years ago, but it's still pretty shaky. I mean, our power grid's shaky. And the Cuban power grid is basically the U.S. power grid from 60 years ago with some electrical tape holding it together for the most part. The highways, with a couple of exceptions, the highways aren't equipped. The rail system's not equipped. But one of their big ventures right now is the Mariel Port, is a transshipment port that's being designed to handle the mega Panama ships after the Panama Canal the enlargement's completed. And they need transshipment ports for that. And they've got a big active project developing that port to handle those ships. And it's at the mouth of the Gulf.
With funding from where?
It's federal funding, but there's also Brazilian venture funding in that as well.
Federal funding?
Cuban funding. The government's putting a lot of their eggs into that basket. They're developing so basically moving the freight port to Mariel and developing it as a modernized, which actually will have the most, if it completes, will have the most tonnage available for transshipment port of those Panama ships anywhere in that part of the hemisphere, which could be a big deal unless there's nowhere to tranship to, right? If the U.S. isn't open, they're going to have this wonderful port that could be used to transship to Europe, but that's not the appropriate placement. At the same time, they're redeveloping the old port as a passenger port, because one of the big threats to tourism if things open up is not enough hotel rooms of adequate quality for the kinds of tourists they want to bring in.
Is there an argument to the U.S. government or business community that it would be appropriate role for the U.S. to invest in public infrastructure to stimulate business in the future rather than insisting only on private foreign?
Yeah, I don't know.
Can there be a accommodation in the U.S. for that kind of?
Well, there can be. In the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is not exactly a radical liberal group in our country, has come out in favor of normalizing relationships, and they've made a number of statements related to infrastructure and the importance of investing in infrastructure if we want an economic relationship between the two countries.
That's something that the Cubans could agree to much more easily than.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's going to end up being more political than business decisions if this is, if current conditions remain in place. I don't know. The Cubans seem very the high-placed people we talk to seem very optimistic. They have plans in place. Whether they don't have the economic capability of executing on those plans. They need money. The tourism industry can feed some of that development, but it's not going to be enough. They're big right now. Their eggs are still in the sugar basket, and the price of sugar.
59 years. Sugar.
Yeah, it's just not. It's not the future of a healthy economy today, unless they turn it into biofuels, which they're talking about, and even then,
I just wondered how you feel overall that the trip went after, I know you've been working and prepping for this for a very long time, and you're hoping to make this an annual trip, and Cubans
I'll
are
let
going
Susan
forward.
take that one.
I think overall, it was very, I mean, it exceeded what I had expected. It went very well, the meetings that we had with our different, the academics and the business people and so on. It went very well, and the access that we had, even to meet at the U.S. interest section, which was really unusual. They're, obviously very occupied with other high-level issues right now. We, I think the plan is, if they're, we're going to get feedback from the students that were on the trip, that we would like to do it again next year. So we're meeting with the students tonight for the sort of the final debrief session with the.
It's our last
group.
seminar night.
Bittersweet, right?
I'm sorry, what?
It's bittersweet now, right?
Yeah, well, we do have
Yeah.
our social event a week
Oh,
from
A week-
tonight at the
yeah,
Cardinal.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree. I felt there was an optimism when we were there in the chances that we had to meet with the Cubans, and a very hopeful outlook on what, what might be possible in the future. And I think, we had these Cuban-American friendship pins that Randy got for everybody, and we all had extras to give away. And I'm surprised they came home with one, because they really wanted these, and so we gave them away at many, many occasions.
I gave away this year's pins and next year's pins
Yeah.
and my reserve pins.
Yeah, so there was just a really, I think, an encouraging feeling when we were there, and we would love to do this again. And now that we've done it once, I think with a group of students, now we know kind of how to fine tune it for next year.
We've done a lot of trips. We've done similar things with Vietnam multiple times, China multiple times, India multiple times. This was probably the most successful first effort that we've had. There's really only one speaker that I would even consider not including. It was just a speaker who gave us party line slides, and
Which can be interesting in another
which is
way,
interesting in
yeah.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had an issue with we had a challenging student in the group. And so it'll be interesting to see if that has colored the reaction of the
Yeah.
other students.
Well, just speaking like as an advisor, I would say that I get a lot of requests for a trip to Cuba, and there are many students who couldn't, maybe miss the deadline, and couldn't
Yeah.
participate this year, and they've already been asking.
We had a
if they
huge
would do it
waiting
again.
list.
Yeah.
I know, and a
Yeah.
huge waiting list, so
Yeah.
hopefully it'll.
We will not have cyber next year, and cyber has provided.
A lot of the scholarships.
Yeah.
I mean, we did this trip with we did the course with a $4,000 course fee that covered those books and the readings and the cases and the visas and the health insurance and
All
the
the
whole
meals,
trip,
everything.
10-day
Yeah.
trip, 3 meals a day. But to do, and every student in the group got at least a $1,000 financial award. More than half of them got $2,000 or more. And some of that came from LACIS, but a lot of that came from cyber, and we won't have that cyber money next year. Center for International Business Education and Research. It's a Title VI.
Federally funded
Yeah.
Title VI program. We did not reapply, so it's not that we didn't get the grant.
We turned the grant down. It
Right.
didn't turn us down.
Put it on your website,
Right.
Yeah.
your banner, on the front of your website.
So, I mean, it was just, the program changed too much, and it wasn't in alignment with what we care about. But it means we don't have that money for next year.
But we will sort that out soon,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. And it may be a window. I mean, this is maybe, we don't know what's going to happen with the election next year. Things
Yeah.
could really change.
We
So
could get shut
We have one
down.
more year to possibly
Yeah.
do this.
We could get shut down and not be able to do it, or we could get buried in an avalanche of schools
Right.
that are
Right.
getting in our way.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's worrisome, is the demand could just skyrocket, and prices are going to go up, and there's not capacity
Yeah.
to,
We saw this, I've had
Hotels.
experience, a lot of experience doing this in China, Vietnam, and now Cuba, in addition to some other places. But early on in China, there weren't many schools doing what we were doing. We were welcomed, we had good relationships, high-level relationships. They always wanted us. And then eventually, so many schools were going in.
but you'd have to pay for
That,
meetings.
you
They
pay
charge
for, you pay for meetings, you wouldn't
Yeah.
get access to the same level of people. In Vietnam, we were in even earlier, different situation, and we've been able to maintain that relationship so that when we go, we get the top level people, we get the top level companies. If we can maintain that in Cuba by being in early, and with the network that we've all been developing, this will be at least an equally high quality experience for students in the future. if it gets swamped, or even if if Cubans figure out supply and demand economics, the prices are already too high, and we have no control over the in-country prices. Cuban government could increase prices for hotels and transport by 50%, and we couldn't do a thing about it.
So it really is just kind of wait and see, you know.
So we're working on the assumption they'll be next year.
Good.
Have to lock in some things first.
Yeah.
I was going to, go ahead, Christine.
Okay, thanks. I was just wondering, you had the issues getting the students, American students and the Cuban students together. Do you have any other issues with transparency or access with any other departments or individuals?
Probably there was less transparency than I thought there was. I think they manage the censorship sufficiently well that it's not always in your face. I think they censor the access to information in such a way that they make you feel they're being transparent and open. That said, I've been really surprised at how open these high-level people were with us. I mean, basically the business manager for the sugar industry says to you in public, our production levels are only at 60% of the world average for the acreage, and the reasons are A, B, C, and B and C are things they've done wrong, right? At some level, that's quite a bit of openness. There are a couple of things that relate to multiple questions that were asked. One of their models for doing business with foreigners in the future as things open is in almost every industry, they want to allow no more than 49% ownership, foreign ownership, and in almost every industry, they want to control employment, meaning that the Brazilian company, the tourism companies, need employees. They have to go to the Cuban agency and say, we need this many of these kinds of people. They pay the government, the employees are paid by the government and come to the company. For most Western companies, neither of those will work because you don't want to go into a business situation where even though you've got a highly educated workforce, they've not yet learned how to strategically manage a business. And if you look at any of the surveys of executives about what's the tipping factor for success in global business, it's recruiting, training, and motivating employees. And right now, the Cuban policy is, in most industries, to prevent either of those from happening. That was Cuban, that was Chinese policy, that was Vietnamese policy, and it worked for a little while. But until they ease that, there are going to be a lot of investors who won't go in at the same level that they might otherwise do. So they need to protect critical industries, and they don't want to have a situation where the country can be raped again economically. But they also need an environment where if I was investing my money, I want to have some influence over the decision-making. And decision-making about strategy, operations, and employment. And right now, the policy is to not allow that.
Well, just we're talking about the meals that you mentioned, the 3 meals a day. Do you have the government-sponsored restaurants and that? Were you able to go to the private Paladares, and can you?
We use Paladares more than state-owned restaurants.
Uh-huh.
The students could, from the moment they walked in the door, they could tell which restaurant was state-owned and which restaurant was a Paladare. Although there were some good state-owned restaurants. There were some very good state-owned restaurants, but we also experienced some where the quality of the food was not the same, the quality of the facility was not the same, the service was markedly different in that state-owned restaurant. I think that, our breakfasts were always at the hotels, which were state-owned, and they were fine. They were good. The lunches and dinners were, I think we were probably 60% private restaurants, 40% state-owned. Of the private restaurants, I think they were